Hello, this is Elif and welcome to the Puzzle the News podcast. Today I am interviewing Dr Zaina Gadema, an assistant professor at Northumbria University in the Faculty of Business and Law. Dr Gadema's research and teaching focus on social and environmental justice with an emphasis on decolonisation, climate change, sustainability and political economy. Before academia, Dr Gadema spent over a decade in the City of London with Magic Circle law firms. Her academic journey includes studying environmental science at Greenwich University and pivotal research on pesticide use in Nepal, followed by a PhD in carbon footprinting of food chains. Dr Gadema's British Libyan heritage and experiences under the Gaddafi regime, combined with her family's history of fighting for justice and liberation, deeply influence her work. This includes a strong connection to Palestine and unwavering support for Palestinian justice. Today, Dr Gadema will share her insights on Palestinian activism, drawing from her academic background and personal commitment to social justice. I am thrilled to have her with us today. So, I would first like to ask you, what inspired you to focus your research on social and environmental justice, particularly in the areas of decolonisation, climate change and sustainability?
What a question. My goodness. I think I'll begin with the obvious, which is positionality is everything in research. And my positionality is very much one that looks to social justice as part of my very essence because of my background. I've grown up in a very multicultural family environment, a multi-faith environment actually, and having lived as a child in Libya and then in England, and spent most of my life here in England, the roots of my positionality are grounded in this sense of purpose to do something in order to give back and to give voice to the voiceless. My religion very much grounds me in that perspective, but it's not just religion, it's really a sense of self and a need to essentially use any tools that we have and that we can embody to really look at things more critically, because unfortunately what I found as a child when I came to the UK was a very, in my opinion, a very skewed, very different way of thinking and learning and being than what I had experienced as a child growing up in Libya. I'm not saying that there's right and wrong, but what I think is really interesting is in terms of humanity, there is a need for us, especially as women from the region, or having experienced different worlds of thinking and belief systems, to essentially always do your best to be on the right side of history. And of course, imperialism, capitalism are the evils of the modern day, and it doesn't take much to really start thinking about the ethical ramifications of the research that you undertake as an academic. And before I actually went in to read environmental science at Greenwich University, I was lucky enough and able enough to have achieved a teaching qualification. It's called a TESOL course, teaching English as a second language. So I was able, in my spare time, to teach asylum seekers, refugees, professionals, English as a second language, because I saw, and I still view this, even though it is an imperialistic language, of course, it's a language of empire, and it's a world language, and it opens doors. And for me, education was a way of freedom, but it was also a way of giving back and empowering others. So social justice and environmental justice are one and the same in almost everything that we do in our existence. So I'm sorry that was a very long answer. But yeah, there's many aspects, I think, to any person's approach in life, and especially if you're an academic, you're very conscious of philosophical belief systems, ethical conundrums, because and then you suddenly realize, hang on a minute, the teaching here is so Eurocentric. There are voices that are completely dismissed. There are whole histories that have been rewritten. So our job as human beings is to be critical, enlightening, to empower, and to enjoy, and be steadfast in our lives, to give back to the younger generations, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that really good answer. And no, your answer, it might have been long, but it was, it was very rich. So it touches on a lot of stuff which we're going to further on discuss. So I just wanted to touch upon, because you all come from a British Libyan heritage, and you have seen of, the Gaddafi regime while there, which obviously has shaped your perspective on justice and liberation, and your family has a rich history of activism. How has all of this, all of these experiences influenced your work and commitment to social justice?
I think it's fundamental. When I think as a child, you grow up in, well, for me personally, I grew up in a I'm so grateful to have grown up in my father's country. And my father's country is a country that is demonized regularly, has been demonized regularly. The people have been demonized, dehumanized. But for me as a child, I'm so grateful now as an older woman to have had the experiences of going to school in Libya. It might have been in the Gaddafi regime, but you don't realize that. I still have my exercise book with Gaddafi on the front, still have the green book. But it was the absolute unconditional love, the rich culture, the heritage of the Libyan peoples, the beauty of the culture, the acceptance of my mother, who is actually, yes, she's British, but she's originally Irish. My grandmother was Irish and my mother's father's Irish. So they have a history themselves of dehumanizing narratives and genocide, of course. And it was just the sheer love and the for example, going to school and being able to recite surahs of the Quran and be celebrated for speaking the language of my religion, and it not be demonized. And those memories will never be taken away from me. And the love of the family, the extended family, and the care. I mean, Libyans, when they look for somewhere to live, for example, they will consider who the family is, who the neighbor is. That is how interconnected the Libyan kind of dynamic is, or was. And there was a lot for me as a child growing up, still remnants of the Italian occupation. So my grandfather, for example, spoke fluent Italian, of course fluent Arabic, he spoke some English. So there was a level of intellectual activity that unfortunately I didn't know this, but increasingly was stymied by the Gaddafi regime. It was a socialist regime that ended up being a dictatorship of very cruel proportions. But my experience as a child was one of having my hands and feet hennaed by my aunties, running around barefoot under the palm trees and amongst the fig trees, and going to school and be celebrated for remembering Surah Al-Fatiha, you know, the Adhan, the call to prayer, the beauty of that, the generosity, the spirit, the acceptance, and of all kinds of different cultures and histories. And those histories are very rich in food, for example. You know, I'd be told stories by my grandmother about, oh, this food used to keep our freedom fighters going up in the mountains, you know, say, eat asida in the morning, keep you going all day. So my memories as a child were formative, and I was very shocked when I came back to England, because I was born in England, but I don't remember too much of my early childhood. Why I was shocked when I came to England was not just the weather, but it was almost like the uniformity of everything, and everything was prescribed, and we never really had a place as individuals. We weren't refugees. My mother said, we are not refugees. But we were in exile, and suddenly we were faced with we were isolated as a very small family. And it was as a child, all I wanted to do, I didn't understand that actually people were disappearing and being sent over to Chad and killed off in these ridiculous battles that Gaddafi was conjuring up. So my parents were really looking out for us, and my grandparents, my brother and I, Mohammed and I, we're the oldest. There's 15 months between us. We both, now I'm in my 50s now, and my brother's just turned 50 a few months ago, and we both remember with searing clarity the very day that we left Libya to come to England, and it was an image, if you can imagine this image of us, two children in the car with an English mum, and my very, very Libyan father with his big afro, very proud man, devastated that we have to go. I didn't know why, but we were leaving, and my aunties, and they're wearing their farashiyas, and the old men, and they're all streaming with tears, and they were ululating. It was profound, and we always thought, oh, we're coming back, it's fine, what's your problem? It'll be fine, we're coming back. And I think that kind of memory can be very formative to you as a child, and shape you as an adult, because you realize that life is not always as straightforward as you would expect, because of where you're born, or who you are, or who your parents are. And that was a big lesson as a child. Also, my British side of the family was staunch Roman Catholic, and had continuous trouble in accepting my father. So there was tension within the actual family itself, and I just never, and I still struggle to understand it. Well, I understand it because of colonialism and the heritage of political thinking and the class system, but at the time I couldn't understand it, mainly because my Libyan family, it goes against every grain of our being. We are supposed to accept and love and be generous and steadfast, no matter what religion you have. And if you're peoples of the book, we still respect that. Even more so, you know, it's our responsibility. But yeah, so I think those childhood moments, you know, those pivotal moments in your psyche that you quite surprisingly retain throughout your life, can really inform your humanity and how you see the world around you. I always thought justice is the absolute non-negotiable in life. And of course I got myself into a bit of trouble as a child for taking that kind of stance, because I just could not understand why injustice was intellectualized and and made into a complex kind of conundrum, full of contradictions. And I was always very, very mindful of my very fortunate existence in the West, because I thought this is an opportunity for me that my cousins do not have. Yeah, simply because my mother is British and has a British passport, I am able to leave. So you do end up with survivor's guilt, of course, but you have to turn that survivor's guilt, because guilt does not help anybody. You have to turn that survivor's guilt into something positive in almost everything that you do. And religion really helps that. One of the big holes for me coming back to the UK was not hearing the adhan, the call to prayer. It's so it's soul stirring, it grounds you. But with our religion, what's so beautiful about it, it's in your soul, it's in your memory. So I'm really grateful for all that love, that unconditional, powerful love of the extended family, the rich culture. That basis I was fortunate to have, whereas my youngest brother and in fact my youngest sister have not had the opportunity to grow up with that, because of the 42-year dictatorship, etc. But nevertheless, we are able to share with our stories and keep the stories alive. But you know what's quite strange is when we moved to London as children, my parents were still being paid by a petroleum company, funnily enough. So of course the petrodollar is huge, of course, across North Africa. But in Libya, they had a firm called Occidental, funnily enough. Can you imagine? It's called Occidental. How Orientalist. Anywho, when we first landed in Heathrow, I'll never forget, I thought, oh, what have my parents done? I don't want to be here. Grey concrete, grey skies. We were staying in Mayfair. I mean, and I thought it was the pits. I really thought it was the pits. And when I have people say to me, oh, you're so lucky because you've got your freedom, you're in England, look, there's no male guardianship, and I think that is absolutely ridiculous and myopic, because do you know how powerful the women are in our in our families? Do you know how large our families are? My father was the oldest of 10 children. His youngest sister passed away, and so he ended up being the oldest of 9 children. Those aunties and those uncles, they're just amazing. My cousins, and to think that the power of the family and the connection of that family cannot be broken, even if you are abroad, is super, super powerful to your psyche in terms of survival, and using your agency and your privilege to live a life as best as you can. So I started my story a bit superficially talking about the material kind of, oh gosh, it was more a psychological shock to me as a child. It wasn't material. This is what I'm saying about materialism does not really matter when you're a child, and well, it might do to Western children, but for me, it was the family. It was being on our land. It was being on our farm. It was fighting for justice against the Gaddafi tyranny, in whichever way we could. And coming to England and staying in Mayfair, and I'm told that you're lucky to be staying there. And I thought as a kid, no, I don't. Yeah, you can have room service. Yeah, that's fine. And then we lived in Kensington. My father got a job. It was quite demeaning for him. He got a job in Harrods as a sales assistant. So I can't explain to you how demeaning that is for an Arab man that comes from a family where yeah, being a sales assistant is so different from working for Occidental and being the eldest of the family and having that kind of status. As a child moving from Mayfair to Kensington, this was in a short, very short period of time, and I went to a school in Pimlico, and I remember comparing and contrasting my school experience in Libya, in Tripoli, Libya, I must say, and that of London initially. And they were lovely, don't get me wrong, they were absolutely lovely. But I felt very different. I felt as though I did not fit in, you know. And then we got the biggest shock of our lives as children, because my parents, what I didn't know was Occidental were paying for the accommodation when we first came to England, which is why we were able to stay in these fairly prestigious places in the initial return. My parents scrambled enough of a deposit to buy a new home, and the home was in the postcode E17 in Walthamstow in East London. So we moved from Kensington, if you can imagine, to East London, which was fine, it was great, but the culture shock, I think it's still it's still with me. I mean, different world. I'm talking about traversing different worlds. And what I'm talking about, the culture shock, was I couldn't understand how in a country that had colonized quite brutally most of the world could have places. Because I remember, I hadn't told you where I was born. I was born in Devon. I was born in quite a lovely place. I was born in Exeter in Devon. So my experiences, very early experience and very early memories, were of quite, you know, green hills, whatever, quite nice. But then moving to E17 and meeting the real Cockneys, lovely people, real sense of family, very welcoming. And going to state school in E17 was very interesting for me, because it was the first time that I'd seen nationalities from all over the world in this East London school. And before we even went to this new school, my brother and I, along with my mother, went to see the headmaster. His name is Mr. Kennedy, a fantastic headmaster. And what I haven't told you is that when we were in Libya, my mum was hilarious, and the Libyans used to laugh, you know, عيشة هي حلوة هي جميلة لكن هي ديما تضحك وتعيط وتغني. So she would sing nursery rhymes, she would teach us English, but our English, as you can probably still hear from my accent, was very much received pronunciation. So it's very Queen's English. It was so it was a very different way of learning English. So when we came to the UK, the way that Mohammed and I spoke and our vocabulary was informed by our mother, who was teaching us sometimes in the siesta or by the beach, or would play the sound of music. So hark back to this visit to this little primary school in the East End of London, and Mr. Kennedy, and we're sitting in his office, and my mother's there, and my brother and I are sitting there, and he is very concerned. He said, look, the children have been away from England for many years now. They will need specialist education and extra help. And apparently, I don't really remember this, but this is what my mother said. Apparently, it was quite warm, and I piped up because we were also, this is another thing, when you're in Libya, the manners of children, the children are cherished. Children are cherished, but we are also very polite. You know, we learn about our social circumstances around us, so we know when to be quiet, and we're very respectful. So I was in my respectful mode, and I turned around to my mum and said, oh, Mama, I'm perspiring, can I please take my jacket off? Mr. Kennedy's just like, I think he almost fell off his chair. So, I don't think we'll need that. And as a child, I remember even as a child observing the world around me in absolute awe. I remember, for example, a Sudanese child who had just begun at the school. And I went home and I said, oh, Mum, Dad, there's a Sudanese black girl. And they said, oh, you really need to look out for her. She's a sister. Da, 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 da. And it was just so interesting because there were obviously many children from very different backgrounds who'd gone through their own kind of upheavals, and their own domestic circumstances changing in response generally to global issues.
Yeah.
And they're impacting you at the very personal individual level. So what was really interesting for me as a kid was seeing all of this, seeing good people like Mr. Kennedy, and having a fantastic teacher like Mrs. Meredith, who was amazed that our mother had taught us to read music. And really took us under her wing and encouraged me, for example, to take up the violin and wind instruments. But we also, Mohammed and I, experienced extreme racism that we just could not get our heads around. And this was the dawn of, well, I'm not sure it was the dawn, but it was very much the time we were living there that the National Front became very I wouldn't say popular is the wrong word, but very impactful on the scene. So we had bricks thrown up through our windows, etc. But we weren't the only ones. It was anyone who was black, anyone who was of colour, and everyone had their own story. So if as a child you go through that and you turn out into an adult and all you're bothered about is materialism, I think you might be a bit strange, quite frankly. I was lucky to have those experiences. They really opened up my eyes as a young child. And then when we moved up to Manchester, it was a different ball game altogether again. So all these experiences kind of inform us on the humanity around us, but also the humanity that is silenced, that the stories that we don't know about, and how voices are often not heard because our parents are just trying to survive, so again, I digress, but that was my kind of influenced music as well. Of course, I've mentioned the violin, but as I became a teenager, I love classical music. I really relished reading, and I think the whole relishing of reading was, again, it was my own, you can escape in your mind, can't you, with reading? So I devoured reading, I devoured music, and my father would play Fairuz, of course, and Kulthum, of course, and other, and of course, Quran. But for me, those, again, very, very formative. And I used to get really frustrated not hearing any Arabic or any kind of validation of being African, because that's another thing. When you're Libyan, you're also North African, you know, it's and then you'll get people who tell you you're not African, and you're just like, don't tell me what I am. We know. We know our roots. And I got very much into the whole Pan-Africanism as a teenager, and into the hip hop scene. I loved hip hop and soul and rare groove, much to the chagrin of my father, who just wanted me to listen to Quran and read Quran. And that was his way of protecting me. But for me, I was wanting to expand and see what the world was about. So that, yeah, those were the early days.
Yeah. And no one can see, because obviously this is all audio recorded, but you are wearing a Palestinian keffiyeh. I want to like open up that side of you. So why is Palestine so important to you? I mean, from your childhood experiences, from what you've lived through, I can see why. But if you would like to expand and kind of just link, you know, your Libyan identity and connect it to like your, you know, your love and your connection that you have with Palestine as well, please.
Okay. So there's numerous elements to this. Palestine and Libya go hand in hand. I think I might have said this before. They're kind of inextricably linked. We are brothers and sisters. Palestine is part of the Ummah. Okay, it's a very, very important part of the Islamic world for us. Not only that, but Palestine is, and we always knew this, is a settler. It has been colonized. It is a land that was full of people. It was not a land without a people. And growing up, again, I guess I'll go back to because I actually ended up back in Libya age 16, which I haven't told you about, because I was told I was going on holiday, but it was actually to get married. But that's another story entirely. But at the time, and again, that is much that's an entirely a different podcast. But if it wasn't for the beauty of the Libyan people, my family, the power of women, I wouldn't be here now. So I just want to say that. But in terms of Palestine, we have to remember that in Libya was at the time that before 1948, the Arab world was in a perilous state. It was at 1911, you know, towards the end of the Ottoman Empire. We had the Italians come and colonize Libya. It ended up with a very dark episode in the Libyan history of a very brutal, fascist, genocidal regime led by Mussolini. It was so bad that what a lot of people don't realize is that the Libyan genocide was marveled at by Hitler and the elite. So Heinrich Himmler, Goebbels, you know, all names that we are infamous, that we're familiar with. The genocide is, again, another podcast, but what is important about that particular genocide is that the form of ethnic cleansing and the genocide of the Libyan peoples took place before 1948, but also at the same time that Palestinians were being subjugated by the British mandate. But in terms of the Libyan context, the Libyan genocide and the ethnic cleansing was the blueprint for the Holocaust that ensued in the Second World War. So not only were we occupied, were we genocided, were we ethnically cleansed, we were also colonized, and the story of our colonization was hijacked essentially by the West. Our most famous freedom fighter is called Omar Mukhtar. I have a portrait of him right here. You can't see it, it's just here. And I've also got one in the window so everyone knows. And if they don't know who he is, I will tell them. Now, Omar Mukhtar was a septuagenarian. He was in his 70s, and he fought the most mechanized, advanced military on horseback. So you imagine they're using tanks, just like they're doing in Gaza today, to mow down people, whole villages, blah, blah, blah. And you have this freedom fighter who is the most well-respected Islamic scholar. And he's a teacher of Islam. So not only is he amazing as, you know, having stood up to fascism, and even in his execution by the fascist regime, he was hung, a public hanging. And his story was put together, funnily enough, by Gaddafi in a film called The Lion of the Desert that he funded, Gaddafi. So obviously it had Gaddafi's kind of twist on it. Nevertheless, Omar Mukhtar, a reader of Islam, a scholar of Islam, the freedom fighter, an intellectual, was a unifier for the Ummah. In Gaza, just to let you know, there's a whole beautiful street that was named after Omar Mukhtar. And Omar Mukhtar Street has been absolutely decimated and ruined in this latest genocide of Palestine. Palestinians were oppressed, and Palestinians know the story of British colonialism. They know the British oppression, and of course the Libyans. We have to remember that colonization drew up the boundaries of countries. They constructed the terms al-dawla, you know, the countries, the regions, and they created the apparatus of oppression. And the Palestinians, many refugees came to Libya and absorbed into Libyan society. What I haven't said about that is, what's very interesting about that is that very much like Palestine, Libya was a melting pot of civilizations. You know, we had the Ottoman rule for many years, and as a trade route and geopolitical kind of its location, for example, its geopolitical positioning as a North Africa in the center with the Mediterranean and long coastline, its borders with Egypt, its borders with Tunisia, Algeria, etc., meant that you had many people, including many Jews. So there was a rich Jewish cultural heritage in Libya. And I think I've mentioned this before, they lived in harmony. There was none of this kind of terrible rewriting of fact and history, and hate against Jewish peoples. In fact, there were many synagogues. There was Jewish art. They would swap meals with one another. Neighbors would swap meals on Shabbat and on Jum'ah. So it was a very rich cultural pot, melting pot of Italians, Turks, Palestinians, Egyptians, And why it's close to Palestine is that I think the tragedies that unfolded in Libya through the Second World War, which had nothing to do with the Arab peoples. The Holocaust had nothing to do with, we weren't the perpetrators of the Holocaust, but we are demonized and dehumanized as Arabs. Is a very it's the same as the dehumanizing of Palestinians. In fact, there are many Palestinians who are born in Libya. And Mohammed Asaf, I don't know if you know the name, many people in the Arab world do. He won the equivalent of Arab pop idol, and he's the singer that sings Demi Falastini. And he was born in Misrata in Libya. And he, as a child, then moved back to Khan Yunis in Gaza, and has always remained true to the Libyan peoples. In fact, Derna, for example, I don't know if you heard about the tragedy of last September in Libya. I think there's way more than 10,000 that were killed overnight from the floods there. I think it was more nearer to 20,000, but they can't. There's no official ability to calculate the figures. There's no infrastructure, or very little infrastructure. But the point is, I mentioned Derna because there was a Palestinian family that was completely tragically washed away, killed whole generations. And Derna itself had gone through horrendous situations with the Arab Spring, fighting ISIS, etc. So Palestine is just part and parcel of who we are. And as a child in England, in my privilege in England, our home was a doorway to all sorts of nationalities. My parents had friends from Lebanon, and I'll never forget in 1982 when Beirut was besieged, and essentially my parents are very good. They tried to hide everything from us. All we knew was the beauty of being able to go to Islamic school on a Saturday. It was so fun, and see your friends, and you saw these different people. But I remember my father weeping. I found him weeping, and a family that he'd known had been the only ones left were a mum and her daughter, her young daughter. And there were a whole range of photographic materials of the massacres, and I came across them as a child. And I remember meeting this very, very quiet woman who was obviously in trauma, and meeting this little girl who was almost silent. And I thought to myself then, this is this, as a kid, I just thought, this is just I wanted to know more about the world. I didn't understand why my English family were always so rotten about my father and the Arab world, and it was just sheer racism. Now I look back, but Palestine, when I asked my father about Palestine, it was very much we are all Palestinians. The Palestinians don't ever use the term Israel. I say that, and even saying that for me is a challenge, and I find it crazy as an academic, as an older woman, and having had my own children, many of whom are grown up. I've got one young one left at home. To hear that the German government, for the citizenship test, to pass the citizenship test, sorry, that was a fraudulent slip, wasn't it? That you have to recognize the state of Israel, when is just dumbfounding. So I think there's too much of a life to explain it for a podcast, but essentially Palestine is in our blood, it's in our souls. Not only the language, the people, they are part of the ummah. The injustices that have been waged from the 1800s. People go on about the last 76 years. It was manufactured way before then. I've just been reading Ilan Pappé's latest book on, it's called Lobbying for Israel. I think it's called Lobbying for Israel. It's in the other room, sorry. But it's a fantastic forensic analytical look at the trajectory, the historical trajectory of the Zionist lobby, and how that unfolded, particularly from the UK. And what made me as a child feel really bad was the fact that I was living in a country speaking a language, the language of the colonizer, and surviving and being told, being told that in order to know your place, that if you work hard you will succeed, if you make good investments you will succeed. And that to me was totally anathema. Materialism was, to me, was unnecessary, because we're taught that it's you only have what you need, you don't, and then you share the rest. And I just couldn't understand why such a global entity like the UK, that had colonized so many countries around the world, literally extractivist policies, that partition, for example, just horrendous, including, of course, Palestine. And then calling that civilization, and then in my own young child's eyes, witnessing the poverty and the inequity in what they have as the class system here. And my mind was boggled as a kid, as you can imagine, because if the people in the West are quick to demonize Arab peoples, but I could not imagine for one moment seeing somebody ever my family ever seeing somebody without, and there not being some collective kind of support mechanism there. And it was, and that's through terror, that's through regime, that's through all sorts of terror. So it's a difficult one. Mm-hmm. I think that England has a lot to answer for, and it's manifested in culture. So you have cultural violence all over the place. So you have children glued to television or TikTok or whatever, following these Western sort of materialistic stars that essentially have no human or moral compass. Their moral compass is totally material, and that is a way of denying humanity. I think justice in every which way. This morning when I went to I dropped my son off, I said to my son, I said, oh my goodness, I hope they realize that there was a car and it had 4 St. George's flags, and it's very windy today, prominently waving, and it's election day, as we know. And I said, oh my goodness, I think that they're trying to give us a statement. They might be voting for Labour. I bet you they're racist. And my son said, why would they be racist, Mum? I said, well, it's the St. George's flag. What's racist about that? I said, nothing. It's a beautiful flag. It didn't, if I don't know if they understand that St. George is a Palestinian. There's so, because of Orientalism and because of this colonized kind of education system that's very Eurocentric, I find that there are people walking around with this false sense of superiority because they're from the UK, when it's actually they're just embracing a very racist narrative of white superiority and supremacy, no matter what they try and claim in terms of equality and rights and identity politics. It's quite simple. Colonizers need to recognize their actions, and to this day the United Kingdom does not look at Australia, look at Canada, look at the legacy of the Chagos Islands, etc. So I think that it's really important to realize that Palestine itself, as Angela Davis came out very, very early on after the 7th of October. And it did not start on the 7th of October. I think I said this to you before. It was in the 1800s. Angela Davis said that Palestine is the litmus test for the world. Unfortunately, it's gone past the litmus test of the world. What Palestine is showing us at the moment, especially those who are critical thinkers and who are for justice and for environment, is not only the tenacity, the steadfastness, the beauty of the Palestinian spirit. And that goes for the men, the women, the children, the elderly. Amazing. What is really important about this is the narrative, because the narrative is hijacked by the politicians, by the lawyers, which is why you have the UK lawyers for Israel arguing for genocide, while you have the United Kingdom now trying to essentially delay the ICC's ruling against Netanyahu and cronies. And we're living in this, and this cultural violence of knowing that all of this is happening means that violence is to us, and it's to our people in Palestine. If people in Palestine are suffering from genocide, it should move every single human being on the planet, because what is happening there is happening in other places. It's just not as well documented or allowed to be viewed. So we have the tragedies that are ongoing all over the global south, and including in parts of the global north. But Palestine itself is the litmus test. It seems as though what's happened with politics, for example, is that politics has become so polarized, so toxic, and increasingly evident how politics at the global, the national, and the local level are inextricably linked to almost every civil society structure that we engage with on a daily, whether it's the health surgery down the road and the NHS system and how they manage that particular centre and how it's funded, what systems they take on, the judiciary. How Zionist is the judiciary? I was standing outside a courthouse, the Crown Court in Newcastle, a while ago. It's probably about 6 weeks ago, and somebody, we weren't allowed to go in. I'd arrived as a member of the public. I wasn't part of a protest, but they're making up rules as they go along. So what happened at this particular courthouse, I was quite shocked, because I was wearing my keffiyeh, and my keffiyeh was underneath a smart jacket, by the way. I was typecast, and I was told, no, you're not allowed into this particular session because you're part of that lot. And it was people protesting. And what I found quite interesting was I remained there, and I asked them, I said, so under what premise? Oh, it's section 55 and section 53. Oh, sorry, section 55 and section 53. You're not allowed in because didn't really understand. And prominent lawyers were walking in and out. Remember, I worked in law, so, and I could feel this particular person that I shared this story with, another academic, Palestinian academic. This particular person saw me, and they oozed power. You know, that you could see they were in a sharp suit. You very sharp look. Had his briefcase, and he saw me. He took one glance at me, and he shook his head, and he said, "Such civic ignorance." And I stood there, and I was like, oh dear. That was my reaction. I said, oh dear. And he walked through the guards, the police and the security guards, took another look at me in frustration and spun on his heel and charged back out to challenge me. And he said, can you not hear them chanting? They're shouting from the river to the sea. I said, first of all, let me just clarify to you what was happening. There were a bunch of protesters that were protesting, and on behalf of this person that was in the courthouse, and they were actually chanting, "Get such and such out, get such and such out." I won't mention the name. Get such and such out. It was say, "Get Claire out, get Claire out." They weren't even chanting from the river to the sea. So that was how ridiculous this question was. And just to give you a little bit of insight, he then said to me, and I just said, oh, I don't understand. He said, so what do you expect to happen to the Israelis? Where are all the Israelis going to go if they're chanting from the river to the sea? And I said, look, this is a very reductive argument. It's not serving anyone, and this is about essentially a freedom for everyone. It's about justice for everyone. It's not about any kind of further injustice that's going to be perpetrated. What needs to happen is that we need to think about a more compassionate situation in the region. I didn't even say Israel because I found it. He said, and he was so frustrated at my response. I think he was surprised. And then he said, oh, he was so frustrated. He said, what about Hamas? What about Hamas then? I said, oh my goodness. It's not like, again, that's very reductive. It's not like Hamas represents every single Palestinian. He was so disgusted, he refused to carry on with the conversation. And I later found out that he is an extremely powerful person in the judiciary, one of the highest. And when I did a little bit more research, I found out that the connections between the institutions like the universities, the university executive, the local judiciary, the national politics, the houses of parliament, all of these individuals that hold positions of agency and power influence what happens in society, whether it's a judicial inquiry, whether it's a ruling, whether it's a new partnership, whether it's research monies, whether it's honours, whether, you know, and the connections to the monarchy. And it's almost as though this country has gone so far right and has gone so into the navel gazing mode of Eurocentrism. They don't want to hear any critical argument or evidence or any sane kind of conversation about the tragedies that are unfolding. Sorry.
No,
it was so surreal, and I just despair, because these voices are voices of power, and they have children, and those children will have agency and power. And this is why we have the Royal Grammar School that teaches its children that you will be the next leaders, you will be in positions of power. We know the big department store on Northumberland Street. That particular family is very powerful, hand in hand with other families like the Goldman family, who founded Sage. So what we need to have, I think, in our Northeast region is a much more compassionate, critical, and inclusive conversation and right to be heard for everybody, because intergenerational brainwashing is playing out in our lifetimes now. So what are we going to leave for our younger generations? We need to break that system, and activism helps that, because those voices are more likely to be heard. I'm very much an advocate of quiet activism as well. So whether it's by the pen, or whether it's going and attending a march, whether it's boycotting products, individuals, and informing yourself, I think those are very powerful tools, because and this goes back to what I first began with, they can't take your mind away from you. So we might not be physically free, etc., but you can with your mind challenge the conventional status quo and demand justice through, for example, in my world, having a richer reading list, you know, reading the pedagogy of the oppressed and really understanding where that comes from as an alternative to Eurocentric scholars. So I think that sorry, education, intellectual inquiry is one form of seeking justice, and sharing that when you can in the classroom, empowering others, whoever they are, is a privilege. And I've been lucky enough to get to that stage where I really cherish my students and the relative agency that I have to speak truth to power, at least in the classroom.
I just put up, but I just say that this whole podcast overall was very, very enriching for me. Like, I've learned so much from like a British Libyan perspective on not just what's happening in Palestine, but just overall, like, you know, globally, there is a lot of political issues that we are seeing. And, you know, especially nowadays with the use of social media, people are able to connect a lot more better, and we are able to see the other side. not just what we see on the television screens, but also what people are able to film, you know, in Libya or in Palestine and other parts of the world. But yeah, thank you so much. Overall, like, it was a very amazing, you know, conversation to have, and I just want to say thank you for your time as well.
Thank you.